With that, I'm going to turn it over to members of my team and my colleagues for the overview of duplication of benefits. I cannot stress enough, sharpen your pencils for this one. This is a critical area for not only the department, but this is a federal issue, particularly in the area of disaster recovery, specific to the area of disaster recovery. We want to assure with the resources that you have, with the resources that the department has oversight for, that assistance goes to those who need it once, not twice, once. With that, I'll turn it over to Carrie Whitehead and Amanda Beck-Plunkett.
So Amanda's got the tough chore here. I just get to tell you about the fun stuff. Basically, we're just going to do a brief overview, but Amanda's going to get into some really good case studies, and she'll give you sort of what duplication of benefits means in a real applicant's file, which I think is a more practical approach to just hearing something wash over you and not really knowing what to take home with you. Because this is something you need to be putting into practice every day as you're running your programs, but you also need to be thinking about it as you are building your programs. And I think folks who are here with our existing grantees know why building it in from the beginning is important. So what is the duplication of benefits? Where does it come from? It's basically just a good governance idea, right? After a disaster, you have a lot of damage to businesses and homes, and you have a lot of sources of recovery assistance. HUD is providing recovery assistance, but Fema is on the ground first. SBA is on the ground before we get there typically. And so, you also have money coming in from other areas, non-federal areas, insurance, state and local governments, and nonprofits. And, we are going to be providing assistance under multiple programs at HUD. For purposes of this presentation, for purposes of the guidance that you'll hear from the Office of Block Grant Assistance and from the Disaster Recovery Special Issues Division at HUD, we're really just going to be focused on CDBG disaster recovery grants. And you may get different guidance from different programs, but the requirement for duplication of benefits is from outside of HUD. It's from this, what did I do? We're just going to click through real quickly here. It's from the Stafford Act. Basically, Section 312 of the Stafford Act just prohibits any person, business concern, or other entity from receiving federal funds, and here's where it gets confusing, for any part of such loss as to which he has received financial assistance under any other program or from insurance or from any other source. Well, that's about as clear as mud. It basically means you have a certain amount of need. If you have money coming in from multiple sources and it exceeds your total need, the amount in excess of your need is your duplication when you're talking about a single purpose. So the same would be true for every purpose for which you're going to need funds. You might need housing rehabilitation assistance. You might need assistance for another area. But you really have to think about what the purpose of the funds are for, the total need within that purpose, and then did you get more than you need? What does the duplication of benefits provision apply to? It applies to federally funded programs that provide financial assistance, and this is directly from the Stafford Act, as a result of a major disaster or emergency. So what we're really looking at is disaster recovery programs. If you're running a disaster recovery program with HUD dollars, you should be thinking about duplication of benefits. But what we're focused on here is how we apply it for the CDBG disaster recovery program. So just walking through an example, we have Mr. Brown, and Mr. Brown's home is damaged by a storm. Here it's a tornado, and he gets an estimate for his cost of repair to be $100,000. But he gets a total of $150,000. It comes from FEMA, from his insurance payment, and from HUD, CDBG. his likely duplication of benefits is $50,000. It's the amount that he's getting from multiple sources that exceeds his total need for that purpose. And so, here's another example. And we use this example because Mr. Brown is an individual. Hamilton County is not an individual, it is an entity. The Stafford Act, which is the umbrella disaster recovery framework that governs all federal assistance following a disaster, applies, and the duplication of benefits provision is in the Stafford Act. It applies to any entity or individual or person. And so it's important to know that you have to be thinking about this for other recipients of funds that are not individuals. So in this case, Hamilton County's wastewater treatment plant gets damaged in a hurricane. They have an estimated cost to repair of $1 million, and they received an insurance settlement for $1 million, and they received $50,000 from HUD. So their likely duplication of benefits here is $50,000. So we're looking at, the main point to take away from this is we're looking at any beneficiary. So Section 312 of the Stafford Act, what other sources of Dob guidance can we look to? Well, it's not up here, but we can also look to the Hurricane Sandy appropriation itself. That appropriation is only available for necessary expenses. And so, if you're getting money and you're paying it out to someone and you're giving them more than they need, you first have to question whether that's necessary. The second piece in the Sandy legislation is the certification of the secretary. That's new. We've never had that in a CDBG disaster recovery certification, statute before, but the certification is that something the secretary must make before he signs your grant agreement. And it basically says you, grantee, have adequate procedures to prevent the duplication of benefits from ever occurring. And that's key. That's kind of at the heart of the Stafford Act, is that when you're giving out federal dollars, you have to prevent, your duty is to prevent the duplication from ever occurring in the first place. But you also have a duty to collect money back if you inadvertently end up sending assistance out the door that results in a duplication of benefits. And that's what makes this provision so scary, because no one likes to call up a beneficiary and say, I got to get that money back from you. So we can also look at the Omb Circulars. Every grantee is subject to some Omb Circular or to general principles of necessary and reasonable cost principles. And so it's important to know that you have to justify all of your costs as being necessary and reasonable. And again, we go back to that question about whether giving out more assistance than the total need is necessary or reasonable. In 2011, November 2011, HUD published a Federal Register notice, and that Federal Register notice, again, applies specifically to CDBG disaster recovery grantees. It is guidance that applies to programs that were that came into existence after the publication of the notice, but it's informative for grantees that had programs going on before the notice. But it will apply to all of the latest appropriation for sure. And then we also have a lot of sample duplication of benefits presentations that we've given at other trainings up on HUD's website. They give different examples. They give maybe a little bit more detail, a little bit more background, and you're welcome to look at those. And you can also call our staff. If you have a question, asking is always better, and it's always better to ask and plan first rather than have to go ask for money back later. The best way to prevent the duplication of benefits is to have policies and procedures in place. And that's part of what we're going to be looking at when you send in information for those of you who have newly appropriated funds for the Secretary certification. However, you are probably going to need more detail for each individual program as you go forward. And so you should have checklists, you should have procedures for how you are going to define what need is. And you can look to the Federal Register notice ahead of time for guidance, but you're basically just trying to have procedures that ensure the use of the funds is necessary and reasonable. And another really great resource for policy and procedures are existing policies and procedures from our existing grantees. So talk to your neighbor, share a piece of chocolate with them, and kindly ask for their existing duplication of benefits policies and procedures. And then the thing to remember going forward is that you're going to need to monitor compliance. And so this is it's something that you usually think about when you're developing your policies and procedures. How am I going to monitor this? What is the risk that a duplication could occur here? One of the things that the Stafford Act provides for is that, one agency might know that funds are coming from another source later and can provide gap or bridge funding until that other assistance becomes available. But in that instance, you have to plan for how you're going to get the money back. Are you going to get a subrogation agreement, or are you going to check in with that individual or entity after 6 months and say, okay, has your insurance payment come in yet? I need to get my gap funding back from you. So your monitoring schedule should be based on the risk for that particular program. And the might be influenced by the amount of money involved or the likelihood that other assistance is going to come in after you. And then you need to recapture these funds if a duplication of benefits occurs. And it is something that our IG monitors for. It is something that HUD staff monitor for when we go down to our grantees. It can be monitored in one of two ways. It can be monitored across programs, or it can be monitored in and of itself, going down just to monitor how you're doing on duplication of benefits. And Amanda's case studies are really going to get into what you should have in your files to be prepared for that monitoring. Just walking through a basic calculation here, like I said, we need to go ahead and identify the total need. Good source of information about total need is, an existing SBA estimate for repair costs, or thinking about the total need to get the job done for that purpose. But it's also important to think about what you're asking for money for. So, for example, housing might be too broad, but you might want to think about housing rehab as a narrower purpose, and it helps you to identify all the potentially duplicative assistance, which is your next task, and then eliminate the funds that are not duplicative. So again, if you identify the need for housing rehab, to identify all the potentially duplicative assistance, you would probably say, okay, let's write down all the housing assistance they got, but then you would eliminate those funds for, say, interim housing that are not duplicative to housing rehab, and just come up with a figure of what you've determined to be duplicative in the end. You subtract that from their total need, and you're going to get their maximum eligible CDBG Disaster Recovery Award. In some instances, that maximum award may later be subject to a cap if you've capped the total assistance available in your program. But you should think about how you're calculating the need, what goes into it. Definitely document that in the file. And it's okay if the need for your program that you've identified is different from the need identified by another agency. CDBG money often comes later in time. Needs can change. They are always taken at a single point in time. And so you may need to go back and revisit, and you can go back and revisit later for that same individual. So, for example, construction costs can go up over time, and you can provide additional assistance later if you need to, and just go through the DOB calculation again for any additional assistance. But I think the point of this slide is just to really look at all sources of funds received by the recipient for that purpose. So yes, the primary sources of funds are going to be SBA and Fema. You may have data sharing agreements that you work on with those agencies, but you need to think about the likely sources of assistance. You need to especially look at what other state agencies in your state might be providing, because other state funds are assistance if they are provided for that purpose, if they are provided to recover from that disaster. And so part of the planning up front is seeing what other programs might exist that are funded by other agencies in your state, and also local nonprofits that are kind of doing the same work. This is really based on the idea that it's recovery starts with the individual. The federal government under the Stafford Act framework steps in last when disasters are big enough that they can't be handled at the local level. And so the duplication of benefits provision is really there to say, when are these federal funds reasonable and necessary? So you should look at all sources of assistance that might be available. Just a few samples, things that should definitely be in your application. You should be looking at what assistance came from FEMA. You can look at an individual letter that a person provides, or as I said, through data sharing agreements. Definitely get written documentation of their insurance, and you should look at other sources, including regular assistance that's provided for the same purpose. Again, it's defining your purpose is very important, but all of this should go into the file. It should be accessible when your internal auditors monitor or when HUD monitors. And you need to train your subgrantees on this, your subrecipients, very well, because it's they will also have the same responsibility. And if you need help making those connections with other federal agencies, HUD is happy to help with that. There's some information and contacts provided in our notice for Sandy. I'm sure most of you have already followed up with that. So again, just driving the point home that really defining your purpose can help you weed out sources of assistance that are not duplicative. So if you have a different eligible purpose for the same funds, then they don't necessarily have to reduce your CDBG-DR award, but you might ask for receipts and how other money was spent to show that it didn't duplicate your purpose. If receipts are not available, and we've had that come up before, people weren't told to keep receipts, call us, talk to us. We can talk about other alternatives. They're usually based on risk. But, getting the word out ahead of time, if you anticipate that your money is going to be coming in after another source of funds, and reminding folks to keep receipts can be helpful. And then you can look at our Federal Register notice. It does go through quite a lot of examples of what might be duplicative and what isn't. For example, private loans, it discusses private loans and other sources of assistance. So just going back to the example that we provided earlier, if you've identified a need of $100,000, you've identified potentially duplicative assistance of $35,000, but But then you really look more closely at that assistance. You say, oh, this $5,000, it was used for debris removal and not for housing, and so it's not duplicative. Then you come up with your final eligible award. And the big thing is, remember your duty to ask for money back if you provide more than you should have. And then think about, well, how am I going to get this individual or entity to pay that money back? You need a written agreement. You need an agreement that spells out for the individual that they will be responsible for repaying those funds. So part of it's an education process for the individual. You know, make sure that your award is necessary and reasonable. How much are you providing? Just document why it's reasonable, and you might think about that for an entire program. You can think about necessary and reasonable for an entire program, but you must, for Stafford Act, make an individual duplication of benefits decision for each applicant or recipient of funds. The Stafford Act applies to the person, and so that's statutory. We don't have any flexibility there. You need to do it for each and every applicant to your programs. I am going to turn it over to Amanda, and she'll walk you through some case studies.
Thanks, Carrie. So believe it or not, Carrie and I were pretty excited when we finished drafting this presentation because we thought it was really interesting. And I can see now from some of your faces that you might not agree, but we'll do our best to keep you interested as we keep going forward. And I'm thinking next year we're going to have Earl do the presentation. He has a way of jazzing things up a bit. So case studies. So the whole purpose of case studies is to kind of put all these policies and procedures and ideas into a real-world application. So we're actually looking at sample files that we've reviewed in the past during monitoring visits, and we're just trying to kind of give you an idea of what we expect to typically see, and then what we typically see or what we don't see, and that can lead to certain issues. So here's the bunch of critical information, and just a few things to note. I'm not going to read through everything on the list because you can have that. You have that in your binders, and you can do it at your convenience. But this is just information for duplication of benefits. So this doesn't include information on eligibility, tied to the disaster, national objective, that sort of thing. That's all information that still has to be included as part of a disaster recovery activity. This is just for duplication of benefits. Most critical things, definition or description of DOB. We realize this might not be in your application. In fact, it's rarely in an application. That said, it's typically in an application packet or some other material that's provided to the applicant so they know what they're getting into. Education is key with duplication of benefits. Education is key for your staff, for grantee staff, for local governments, and for recipients. As Carrie and I can attest, and anybody in disaster recovery, duplication of benefits is not simple. And so any way that you can kind of make it clear to folks that the primary purpose, as Carrie pointed out, I thought incredibly well, is that we can't pay for something twice. And so if they've already received assistance from multiple sources and that exceeds their need, there is a duplication of benefits. And again, the whole point of duplication of benefits is just to protect the taxpayer dollars and to make sure that people don't profit kind of in an unwarranted manner. A few other things: you have to identify the applicant's need, identify all sources of assistance. You have to verify FEMA, insurance, and SBA. You have to do the award calculation. You need a subrogation agreement and recapture policies and procedures. A few other things to note. Well, just I guess one last thing to note before we move on. In our experience of monitoring files, grantees can have multiple systems or files where they're collecting all this information. And so we're not going to say that everything has to be in one centralized location. What we do ask, though, is that there's some type of way that you cross-reference where that information is so that we can find it when we're looking or the OIG's looking or you're looking as a monitor of these files. We just need to be able to find it and see where it is. So now we have 5 different examples, and these are just common activities that we see pretty often in disaster recovery. And the first is single-family rehab. And so the activity is just rehabilitate a home damaged by a hurricane. And then here are some excerpts from the file. Application states there was damage, but there's no cost estimate. But we have some contractor's estimates, so that can be pretty helpful. We have a signed affidavit regarding insurance and FEMA, and we also have a copy of an insurance payment and a statement from the homeowner saying how those funds from the insurance were used. Okay, so how did the grantee's policies and procedures work? In the file, we couldn't necessarily see the description of DOB. That could be okay. That just needs to be somewhere. So if it's in the application packet or if it's posted on the website, just somewhere that we can later verify and document that the grantee kind of gave the applicant an understanding of what they're dealing with, that would be helpful. Identification of CDBG-DR need. We have yes checkmarked, and then we have a question mark. And the question marks are just things that we either didn't see in the file or obviously we have questions about. And so I'll circle back to why we have a question mark. Next, identification of source of assistance. So we had that certification and that talked about insurance and FEMA, but it didn't talk about SBA and it didn't talk about other sources of funds. Your three biggies when you're dealing with duplication of benefits, and these are key, and you should all be familiar with these three: insurance, FBA. There is no FBA. Insurance, SBA, and FEMA. You have to be cognizant of those three and verify those three. There are other sources of funds, as Carrie mentioned, from charitable institutions or nonprofits or state agencies or local agencies. And you need to ask about those as well. But the three big ones that we predominantly see over and over and over are FEMA, SBA, and insurance. So the certification was not comprehensive because it lacked some of those items. Verification of FEMA, SBA, and insurance, well, not so much. We had verification of FEMA and insurance, but nothing on SBA. The award calculation. And this really does tie into the need. So we had those estimates from the contractors, but because we had that statement from the homeowner that they had received insurance and used it to repair the roof, we don't know whether those contractor estimates were prepared before or after the roof was fixed. And so we don't know exactly what the need of the homeowner is at this time. And so my guidance to you would be, if you're using contractors' estimates, that can be a great way to figure out the need, but you need to have some type of way that you're either time dating or stamping that so you know at this particular time this was the need, and either repairs happened before or after that time so you can figure out what is still needed today. Method to recapture funds, like a subrogation agreement, that wasn't in the file. Recapture policies and procedures. Again, this might not be in the file, but we sure expect you to have it. And with the new Sandy law, it does require, as Carrie was mentioning, the Secretary's certification. And it also talks about policies and procedures. And so we really encourage you to strongly work with your existing grantees in HUD to get those recapture policies up and moving, and to check with us and your other grantees to see if you have any questions. So this is the second example. It's a multifamily reconstruction. And most of you in this room probably know what reconstruction is. For the few who don't or aren't as familiar with CDBG, reconstruction is basically just rebuilding something from the ground up. It's when the damage is so severe that it's essentially new construction, but it's basically in the same footprint. So here we have a 20-unit property that was badly damaged by a hurricane, and so as a result, it's going to be rebuilt in that same location. We have a couple things that we noted. Certification, no other funding available. And then the second one that I thought was really helpful is that elements of activities that are reimbursable by FEMA or fundable through the SBA or other sources cannot be undertaken with these funds. And that's pretty broad, so we like to see things that are all-encompassing. It's helpful. So the effectiveness. So as you can see, we have a lot of check marks, so they did a lot of things right here. The certification was good because it was nice and broad, but there was an issue with the verification because there was no accompanying documentation in the file certifying as to FEMA, SBA, insurance, that sort of thing. So we couldn't really tell what else had actually been received by the applicant, or we couldn't verify that information. Third example is a multifamily rehabilitation. And this was a project where they were hardening 120 public housing units. And really quick, just to kind of take a quick note away from DOB, the whole issue of hardening, I know, will probably come up with Sandy as you're going forward and trying to make units stronger and better and safer post-Sandy. Hardening is typically one of those activities that we see as part of a broader rehabilitation project. So where you have actual damage and you're fixing walls, you're fixing windows, you're actually fixing the structure, and you're incorporating these methods to make the building stronger going forward. That being said, hardening can be sometimes eligible, but you still always have to have a tie back to the disaster. That tie back to the disaster is most easily demonstrated when you actually have damage. It becomes a little bit more difficult if you don't have some type of building, the building didn't sustain some type of damage or some other physical evidence that it was impacted. So effectiveness, it was pretty good here. I would like to note, typically when you see check marks in 3 different columns, they kind of work together. The identification of the need, identification of sources of assistance, and the award calculation. Typically when you have those first 2 things, you can calculate the award. The problem becomes when you don't necessarily have a verification of FEMA, SBA, and insurance. Because even though you can calculate the award, you can't verify its accuracy. Because if you can't verify FEMA and SBA and insurance, you don't know if your award is correctly taking into account other monies that might have been received. Example 4 is infrastructure, and that's just improving a wastewater treatment facility. Again, just like to point out the 3 check marks. So they had those 3 things, but again, they couldn't verify FEMA and SBA, and so we don't really know the accuracy of the award calculation. Last example is economic development. So providing working capital assistance to a business impacted by flooding. Working capital assistance can be difficult, as a lot of you probably know, because sometimes it's you're working with businesses who can't very clearly identify their need, and yet we have to be able to do that to show how our award relates to the need and how it relates to what their impact was from the disaster. So that's something that you need to make sure is in the file. Identification of sources of assistance, they were good on that. Businesses tend to be able to document FEMA and SBA. They just tend to sometimes have a little better record keeping, sometimes, than homeowners regarding SBA and FEMA and all those sorts of things. And last, the award calculation. I just want to note, because it was difficult to identify the need here, it was difficult to do the calculation. Because if you don't have that number, that initial number, even if you have the number that you can subtract, you can't figure out your final number. And so those 3 are all critical pieces of the puzzle. Okay, quickly moving to sample policies and forms. Policies are vital, and I can't stress vital enough. Policies are vital to a successful program, and as Carrie did a great job mentioning, this go-round's a little different because you have to develop those policies up front and submit them to the department so we can take a look and make sure they're adequate to prevent DOB. And we have a couple samples up here. These by far are not the only 2. These are just 2 that are on the web and so easy to find. And I also should point out, obviously you can't use the links when they're all printed, but when you go online, when these are eventually posted on our website, everything that you can see in this presentation is hyperlinked, so you can easily access a lot of these other states in these files. So these are 2 from the state of Texas and Iowa. And then moving on, we have a sample application from Nashville, Davidson County. That's pretty helpful. Again, almost all of our experienced grantees have applications, and I think I can speak on behalf of them when I say they're more than willing to share them. So don't feel like you have to reinvent the wheel if something's already out there. You might have to modify it to meet your existing needs, but please feel free to avail yourselves and use these materials that already exist. Just continuing on an application. So this one is helpful because it contains slots for the FEMA registration number and the SBA registration number. And this can make it a lot more, not a lot easier, but it can make it easier for the grantee to go ahead and verify this information when they're later working on their data sharing and getting that information from these other agencies. Speaking of still the rehab application, it's helpful to know whether the homeowner has a mortgage on the property. If there's a mortgage on the property, it's most likely that they have insurance. So it could be a red flag if they have a mortgage, but you don't see any insurance proceeds. And vice versa, if they have a policy but they didn't receive any proceeds, again, that's another issue. Or if they have a mortgage, but no insurance, that could be a red flag. The other thing that a lot of grantees typically do is require a title search just to verify the information that they're getting from the applicant. Moving on, this is a sample insurance affidavit. This is one good way to collect from the homeowner or the business any information that they had regarding their insurance. But again, you really need to verify this information. And typically, states have state insurance agencies that they can work with that are collecting and documenting this information, but not all states have that. And so if you're kind of in the situation where you don't know what you're dealing with, please, again, ask our existing grantees because they've developed some really unique and helpful ways to deal with this. Sample gap financing form. Gap financing comes into play when you'll have a duplication of benefits, and so as a result, the homeowner or the business needs to bring money to the table to finish the project. So for example, if an applicant got FEMA assistance to repair their home, and they can't demonstrate that all the funds were used for repair, then there could be a situation where they might have to bring $2,000 to the table to complete the CDBG-DR activity. And so this is a way that the homeowner can document what they've received, how they've used it, that sort of thing, in order to give the grantee a better idea of how the financing is going to come together for the project. Evaluating other sources of funds. So this is something that we created and that you guys could easily recreate or we can provide. And this just kind of walks you through our notice that we published back in 2011. And it goes through all the different ways that we evaluate funds that are non-duplicative. So funds for a different purpose, funds for the same purpose but what were used for a different eligible use, funds that were not available, private loans and other assets or lines of credit. So again, that's just a helpful tool that you guys can use as you're walking through these applications and you're looking at all the assistance to really determine what is duplicative and what's not duplicative. Next is our allowable cost worksheet. And so allowable costs, and this is something that I know Mark Mitchell has done a lot of work with, and that can be really helpful. Allowable costs are essentially those things that the grantee or the applicant has received funds for, and they can demonstrate that those funds were used for a quote allowable purpose. So for example, if a homeowner gets funds from FEMA and use those funds for interim housing assistance, that will not duplicate our assistance for rehabilitation. So if they can document that that assistance was indeed used for interim housing, that's an eligible purpose from FEMA. Privacy waiver, this is critical. You're going to need to make sure that your applicants understand the information that they're providing and that they're willing to provide the information. So this really does need to be in every file and given to every applicant. Verification checklist. This can be really helpful for state grantees who are monitoring a local government, or for even local government grantees who are monitoring their own files. Essentially, this is just a checklist that you put in the file that you can go through and make sure that everything that it should be in the file is in there. And it's just a helpful tool to kind of make sure you're meeting your compliance goals. Subrogation agreement. Again, another really critical tool. So we have some samples here and excerpt language. Please feel free to work with other grantees and HUD staff, and we're always available to talk with you. It might vary, or it could vary, the language that you use by program, whether you're dealing with businesses or homeowners. So feel free, again, reach out to your other grantees or reach out to us and we can help you work on this language. Last, recapture policies and procedures. In the event a duplication does happen, you need to be ready to deal with it. And so it's good to have these policies and procedures developed up front so you know what you're getting into. Monitoring. Couple different ways you can monitor for the prevention of duplication of benefits. You can monitor in the course of reviewing an activity. So for example, if you're monitoring a single-family housing program, as you're monitoring that program for eligibility and national objective, all those different things, you can also monitor for DOB. Or in the alternative, you can just monitor DOB across a number of programs or across a number of activities. It's really your choice. It's the choice of HUD when they're doing their monitoring. It's the choice of the grantee or subgrantee when they're doing their monitoring. When you're reviewing policies and procedures, 3 key things. Do they prevent a DOB or seek to prevent a DOB? Do they seek to ensure awards are necessary and reasonable? And do they describe the recapture process? Again, we're reviewing individual files for all those things we went over previously. So need, source of assistance, verification, calculation, all those key elements that determine, that ultimately determine the applicant's award. Just some key responsibilities. So the beneficiary or the applicant, they have to be willing to provide the information. Without that information, we can't calculate the award. The local agency has to analyze the needs and create policies. And again, this is only applicable if a local agency is involved. So providing funds or administering a program, that sort of thing. And they have to maintain records. A grantee depends if they're administrating a program directly or if they're using a method of distribution, and in that case, just monitoring a local grantee. So if they're administering directly, they'd also have to do an analysis of the unmet needs, do intake, quality control. But in addition, they need to do monitoring and have procedures and create monitoring tools, and then evidence from that monitoring that supports DOB compliance. And when we're talking about evidence from that monitoring, we're just meaning that when HUD comes to visit or the OIG comes to visit, we need to see the results of your monitoring and what your monitoring ultimately found. Tools for monitoring. So we created, we think, helpful exhibits that are specific to CDBG disaster recovery. As you guys all know, there are plenty of exhibits out there for the regular CDBG programs, but they don't always address the nuances of disaster recovery, especially in regards to duplication of benefits. And so if you haven't already, I would encourage you to jump on our website, and probably the easiest way to find these is just to do a Google search. The exhibits are, I believe, in the latest CPD monitoring handbook, which is 6509.2. Is that correct, HUD folks? 6509.2, I believe. And so those are the most up-to-date ones. If you use the old one, they're not there. So you want to be able to find the new one, because they contain all the exhibits specific to disaster recovery, which do address duplication of benefits issues. Finally, we have a Dob Review Worksheet. And this can be really helpful if you're reviewing activities across programs just for DOB. This is just a helpful kind of snapshot overview that you can use to identify critical information for each file that you look at. And last, what if a DOB is discovered? You have to seek to recapture the DOB per your policies. You need to, now if you can, work with other grantees and HUD to develop those policies. If you have them now and if you have them in advance, it's going to be a lot easier down the road when you're trying to seek that recapture. And last, if it cannot be recaptured, HUD's going to need to be repaid. And so now on that happy note, do we want to do the example?
I think we're supposed to do a break at 9, so we can just give them the answers.
Okay. So we provided a sample DOB issue for you guys. We're running out of time, so unfortunately we're not going to be able to get through it. But we do have a copy up front that Carrie's going to pass out that contains the answers. So if you get some time this morning that you kind of want to run through it, and if you have any questions, feel free to ask us, or you can always shoot us emails after the conference. And I guess we have maybe just time for just a few questions if you have any questions. And actually, we'll just put the answer out front at the registration desk so everybody can grab that.
Okay. Thank you. I may be stabbing in the dark or off base here, but this morning we heard that Governor Cuomo was going to be asking for $200 and some million to do a voluntary buyout program. And it just occurred to me as you were presenting that what if homeowners have already received an insurance payment or other things, and then we come in and buy out as well? Is there any impact on the having received insurance and we buying the house out as well?
And that's a great question. So that's actually pretty common, just due to the whole buyout scenario. And FEMA's buyout program and our buyout program typically can come in quite a bit later, after assistance has already been provided for rehab. So typically, if the homeowner has already rehabbed their home and they can document that, there will be no duplication of benefits with the buyout, so their buyout award will not be reduced. Right. If they haven't spent the money to rehab the home, that could possibly be a duplication of benefits. Any other questions?
We've been approached by a homeowner that was dipping into their 401k to pay the balance to elevate their home and to rehabilitate. Would that be considered a duplication of benefits?
Not necessarily a duplication of benefits. Are you a new Sandy grantee?
Yes.
Okay. So that becomes sort of a reimbursement issue, and so it's not necessarily a duplication of benefits issue. It becomes an issue of whether the need is still outstanding, and we can touch base offline, but that's not necessarily a duplication of benefits issue.
Another question is that the homeowners are refusing to apply for SBA, or they also apply and then they reject it, and I understand that has to go into the calculation. So if they don't apply, who does the calculation for SBA? And then maybe in addition to that, can you help with getting the certification and the data from FEMA? You talked about data sharing. If you could
So I'll
help
start
us
with the easy question first. Data sharing with FEMA, that's the easy question. I don't think we have any FEMA representatives in the room, but we do have a number of FEMA contacts, and we'll touch base after this and make sure you have the right name and the contact number and all that information so we can get going. We'll also put you in contact with some of our other grantees, because I know you're not the only one that's had that issue. So we'll see if we can get Louisiana and Iowa folks and Mississippi to give you any hints about getting that data. Regarding the SBA, so that is something that we're working on putting some guidance out there, because we do realize there's been some mixed messages. So we're working on that and hope to get that out as soon as possible, just to give you guys a little bit more information. Any other questions?
We are an older disaster, so we're not Sandy, but one of the things that occurs is that we get information saying a home was totally destroyed. They received FEMA money, and in the FEMA award, it says home repairs. Mm-hmm. These people don't have a home to repair. They have nothing left. So when we ask for how they spent their FEMA funds, they are very glad to tell you they had to spend them for housing. They bought some of the necessary things, pillows, pots and pans, and that. Did I understand you to say that if it is for housing, it's not duplicative?
It depends. I hate using that word. I sound like such a bureaucrat, but it depends. Typically, if they get their FEMA money and they actually use it for repair of the housing, that will not be a duplication of benefits per se. It might reduce the award, though, from CDBG disaster recovery. For example, if they have a home that was damaged and they spend $25,000 of their FEMA to repair part of that home, we're not going to cover that thing that what they've already done. We're gonna try and pay for what's left.
We were tornadoes, so
Right.
These were wiped completely out, so there was nothing to repair.
So then that opens up a whole another set of questions. I think we need to touch base probably after this to work on your situation one by one, to see if we can figure out exactly what FEMA provided the money for. Sometimes FEMA can be, sometimes they can be open to providing additional documentation that illustrates that there was no DOB. So maybe that could be a situation that we could work on with your applicants, but we'll just have to see. It'll be a case-by-case basis. And I think that's it for questions. So one more. No, we're done. We're done.
I have to have a question.
Okay, one question.
It may be somewhat unrelated to what you're talking about, but I'm curious about something. We potentially may have quite a few second homes, right? Mm-hmm. And so I'm trying to think about the definition as to what it is that you look for. What's the definition of a second home? Like maybe you live in there 2 months, less than 2 months, more than 3 months, I don't know. And also, do you have a guidance or checklist for establishing what is a second home?
So the second home, you're a Sandy grantee, correct? Yeah. Connecticut. So the guidance for second homes, I believe we defined a second home using the IRS definition in our notice. Tennille, is that correct? We used the IRS definition of a second home? Yeah. So that's where you'll have to go. I think we do reference in our notice the actual statute or the regulation, so you'll have to look at that to see how they define it, and we're using that language. And we don't have a checklist or anything like that. Again, we can possibly develop something down the road if that would prove useful for you guys, but for this point, just stick with that IRS definition. And with that, Tennille, do we just want to go straight to break?
One, I understand that the duplication of benefits is complex, and our team has done a great job, actually, of breaking it down into the steps that are applicable to your program. A few items to note as you're doing program design and mindful of the duplication of benefits requirements. This notion of the recovery of funds, it's an acknowledgement that, again, it could be that circumstances beyond your control or that the applicant wasn't entirely truthful when they applied, that you then discover that there has been a duplication. You must have a method for recovering that assistance. But this is not exactly unique to duplication of recovery. For any of your programs, when there has been any evidence that someone indeed was ineligible, that the information they used to apply was not altogether factual, you must have policies and procedures in place to get the money back. The second is in your program design, identifying maximum and minimum assistance amounts. For rehab in particular, one of the examples we gave yesterday in a conversation in a roundtable, for some folks, the level of rehabilitation assistance, it might actually cost you more to do your environmental review than it would cost to repair their home. So understand where you need to have some minimums as well as maximums. Maximums come into play when you're trying to understand the award that you can provide to an individual. The other in program design and application, again, that ties into duplication of benefits, is going with a first come, first served policy. That's not an assessment of need. That's a line of people and the news media standing outside your offices watching all of these folks get mad because you haven't assisted them yet. Don't do that. Have a means for prioritizing assistance among your potential beneficiaries. And it gets back to identifying the need, not only overall, but how you'll ultimately determine what exactly you're focusing on for the purpose of your assistance. And with that, I will let it go to break. And